Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Emma sat on the edge of the couch, holding a cup of cold coffee. Frank was asleep in the bedroom, as usual, barely mumbling good night as soon as his head touched the pillow. Emma glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. She didn't feel like going to bed. She felt that the day had been wasted. The same as yesterday, the same as the day before. The same conversations, the same familiar gestures, the same cozy, but so boring order. Even on weekends, supermarket, cleaning, lazy TV watching. Every minute seemed pre-scheduled. Deep down, she knew it was wrong. She loved Frank. Yes, he was a quiet, laid-back man who loved spending evenings at home, surrounded by familiar things. He loved his old leather couch, his books on world history, his radio programs that Emma found deadly boring. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her life seemed to hang on a single point. Soon it would be 5 years since they'd been married. Emma didn't understand when their relationship lost the spark it had had in the beginning. She, too, had once loved sitting next to him on the couch, reading books or watching old movies. Everything seemed new, interesting, unusual. But over time, she set the cup on the table and rubbed her temples, trying to push away the oppressive thoughts. She brought up the question herself many times. Why not go somewhere? Just for a couple days, a weekend. Just a change of scenery, she'd said, when he'd shrugged his shoulders without taking his eyes off the paper and said, Why? It's fine at home, too. Let's not waste money. Emma sighed, remembering a recent conversation. Then she had suggested a short trip to the sea. Just 2 days. She persuaded enthusiastically. We can afford some rest. You said yourself you need to reset after work. Frank, without lifting his eyes from his book, replied, We just recently remodeled. It cost a lot of money. Let's wait until we have more money saved up. But how long can we wait? Emma's voice got a little louder. We keep putting it off. You think I want to go to the Maldives? I'd settle for a motel by the lake, just to get away from sitting here. He put the book down, looked at her with a slight weariness. I just don't see the point. You're being overdramatic. I'm comfortable here. Isn't that enough for you? And that look, indifferent, she thought, silenced her. She felt ridiculous, like a capricious child, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her wishes were being ignored. A few days passed, but the resentment wouldn't go away. She tried to be gentler, to talk more, to support Frank, but all she got in return were the routine words, How was your day? And a careless good. Emma was not an impulsive person. She was used to finding compromises, looking for solutions. But now, sitting alone in the dark living room, she felt her strength was running out. A new day loomed ahead, completely predictable. Morning, cooking breakfast, work, evening, TV, and again, emptiness. She didn't know how to tell her husband that she was tired of living in this vicious circle. A noise outside the window distracted her. Emma got up from the couch, looked out the window, and saw passers-by laughing and arguing about something. Their voices were loud, lively, full of energy. She involuntarily felt envious. When was the last time she had laughed like that? When had anything really made her happy? Emma glanced at the clock again. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. She turned off the light in the living room and headed for the bedroom, but stopped in the doorway and took a long look at her sleeping husband. Frank was lying on his side, his breathing even and calm. He looked so familiar, so familiar. She tried to understand. What had happened? Why didn't she just want to sit next to him and listen to the radio anymore? Why did every day remind her that life was passing her by? Emma exhaled quietly and lay back on the bed. She lay on her back, looking up at the ceiling, and felt something inside her change. The office was in its usual bustle. Phones ringing, someone hurriedly going through papers. A lively conversation could be heard in the conference room. Emma sat at her desk, leafing through her email, but what she was really thinking about was how much had changed in her life over the past few years. She felt like a prisoner of her routine, unable to see any way out of it. When her colleague Sharon came over and lightly tapped her finger on the desk, Emma looked up. You have an urgent email from your boss. Sharon pointed to the monitor. Looks like we're in for a little surprise this week. Emma frowned and clicked on the notification. The header of the email read, Business trip to Miami. New opportunities for the team. Her heart beat a little faster. She quickly ran a glance over the text, making sure it applied to her department. Yes, indeed, the next week should be busy. Negotiations with clients, participation in a seminar, and, most interestingly, Miami. Sharon, leaning over her desk, sighed happily. So, ready for sunny beaches and tropical cocktails? Emma smiled. It's work, you know. There won't be time for beaches. Oh, come on. You deserve a little fun. Especially when who knows when there'll be another opportunity like this. Emma couldn't argue. The last few months have been endlessly monotonous. Perhaps this trip would indeed prove to be just what she needed. When she got home that evening, Frank was already sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. His t-shirt was slightly wrinkled, and the stack of newspapers at his elbow suggested that he'd spent the evening in the usual way, reading and occasionally looking out the window. "You're late," he said, not taking his eyes off the paper. "There was a meeting. I just wanted to talk to you." Emma took off her coat and sat down across from him. "I'm going to Miami next week." Frank pulled away from the paper for a second and looked at her. "Sounds good. You'll have some fun, get some work done. I'm happy for you." Emma frowned, but hid it behind a strained smile. He spoke as if he didn't realize this was a chance for her to feel freer. "I was thinking, maybe we could go together? After I'm done with my business, we could stay a couple more days." Frank shrugged his shoulders. "You know I don't like traveling, especially since I have things to do here." Emma licked her lips, trying to keep the barb out of her mouth. She got up, took a cup out of her locker, and set it on the table. "Okay," she said, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Just thought it might be a good opportunity." Frank nodded, not taking his eyes off the article. The next morning, as she left the house, Emma felt everything inside her shift. She didn't yet know what was going to happen in Miami, but she had a feeling this trip was going to change something. Over the past few years, her world had become too predictable, too limited. Emma hadn't expected that this chance to break out of her routine, offered by her superiors, would open up such opportunities for her. The next day, the office confirmed the final composition of the trip. Initially, Sharon was supposed to fly with Emma, but just the day before the flight, she came down with a high fever. The bosses didn't want to postpone the negotiations, so they urgently searched for a replacement. The choice fell on Jason, a charismatic, communicative, and experienced specialist who could support any conversation and dispose to his clients. Emma found out a couple hours before the flight. "I guess I'm in luck," Jason said, appearing at her desk with a suitcase in his hand. "Instead of boring office hours, you and I are going to have a work weekend in Miami." Emma only nodded, inwardly adjusting herself to a professional tone. She wasn't close to Jason, but she knew he was known around the office as a man who was easy to get along with, especially with women. Now, they were flying together. As the plane touched down, Emma looked out the window and saw the golden sunset painting the streets of Miami a warm hue. She hadn't realized at that moment that this city would change her more than she'd ever imagined. Emma stepped into the hotel lobby, clutching a file folder in her hands. It had been a long day, client meetings, presentations, a short coffee break. She felt like a squeezed lemon. Her mind was full of thoughts, but mostly all she wanted to do was get to her room, change into loose clothes, and sit on her bed with a cup of tea. "Emma," a familiar voice called out to her from across the hall. She turned around and saw Jason standing at the bar, holding a glass of something brightly colored and clearly alcoholic. His impeccably pressed shirt, his sleeves casually rolled up, his confident gaze, everything about him said, "I know what I want out of life, and I always get it." Emma smiled involuntarily, though she could feel the tension rising in her shoulders. "I was just about to text you," he said, stepping closer. "I wanted to invite you for a cocktail. Work is work, but you have to take a break once in a while." "Thanks, but I think I'll skip it," Emma replied, her eyes down on the folder. "I'm tired, and I have to get up early tomorrow." "Boring," Jason said with a slight chuckle. "You know, one thing I've noticed is that you always look so serious. It's like you're afraid to relax a little." "That's not true," she countered, frowning slightly. "Really? When was the last time you did something for pleasure?" He looked at her, tilting his head as if he wanted to catch her gaze. Emma thought for a second, but then shrugged. There wasn't much time, but now there was. Jason pointed to the bar. "Just one drink. I won't insist on anything elaborate, just to celebrate a successful day." His confidence, the lightness in his voice had an odd effect on her. He was the opposite of her husband Frank, was always thinking ahead, rational, planning months ahead. Jason seemed to live in the here and now, not thinking about tomorrow. "All right, one drink," she said at last, feeling a little relieved by the decision. They walked to the bar, and Jason gestured for the bartender to come over. Emma felt awkward, as if she were doing something forbidden, but there was something exciting about it at the same time. "So what do you prefer?" Jason asked. "Probably something light," she answered, still not quite believing she'd agreed to stay. He nodded and ordered 2 cocktails. As the bartender prepared the drinks, Jason leaned against the counter, looking at her intently. "Are you always like this?" he asked suddenly. "Like what?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "Like focused, tense? Like you're afraid of doing something wrong?" "Maybe," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "Look, I don't mean to be intrusive," he continued, "but I just don't understand why you have to limit yourself so much. Miami isn't just about work. There are 1,000 ways to feel alive here." Emma wanted to object, but instead she looked at the glass the bartender had placed in front of her. The light of the cocktail played in the glass, catching her attention. Jason raised his glass. "Here's to a great day," he said, "and here's to an even better tomorrow." She smiled, clinked her glass with his, and sipped. The flavor was unexpectedly pleasant, with a hint of citrus and a slight sweetness. "See? Better," Jason said, watching her reaction. Emma nodded, feeling her tension begin to ease a little. She thought she'd only have one drink, but Jason's skillful conversation led her into a discussion of travel, of places of interest, of his outlook on life. His words sounded so easy, so natural, that she didn't notice how the time passed. At some point, he looked at his watch and said, "Now, come on, I want to show you something." Emma frowned, though she couldn't hide her curiosity. "Where?" "Don't be afraid, it's not far away. It's a 5-minute walk." She hesitated, but something in his confidence made her agree. They left the bar together, and when they were outside, she felt the light night breeze on her face. Jason walked beside her, confident and at ease, and she followed him, as if carried along by this invisible flow of energy. They came to the terrace of the oceanfront hotel, where a cocktail glass was an essential accessory and the hot ocean breeze wafted lightly through the space. Emma could hardly remember the last time she'd felt so relaxed. Jason was sitting across from her, shaking his glass of amber liquid and telling a story about a crazy client who'd started a philosophical lecture on the nature of success instead of a business conversation. Emma laughed. The laughter was genuine and light. Jason talked about his trips to different cities, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Miami, with such energy that she couldn't help but catch his enthusiasm. He seemed interested in everything, found pleasure in everything, even if it was just a cocktail by the pool after a long day at work. "Listen," he said, leaning a little closer, "you're not just going to sit in your room after all the meetings, are you? This is Miami. The air is different. It smells like adventure." Emma looked at him with a smile, but didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to respond. Jason was relaxed, not tense, and, most importantly, he was saying something she was afraid to admit to herself. "I thought so," he said, noticing her expression. "You haven't even been to the ocean since you got here, have you?" She shook her head. "I thought it would be kind of weird, alone. But you're not alone. I'm here." He grinned again. Emma felt a slight tingle somewhere in the back of her mind. At first, she didn't know whether it was guilt, fear, or, on the contrary, a desire that had been suppressed for too long. When they'd had another drink, Jason suggested, glancing at his watch, "I've got it all figured out. Tonight, you'll finally feel like you're in a movie. We'll go for a walk, catch some waves, swim." She looked at him in surprise. "Swim at night? I don't know." "Don't know what?" He smiled broadly. "Miami without the ocean at night is like a birthday party without candles on the cake." Emma hesitated. Her familiar voice inside said, "This is wrong, stupid. You're a grown woman." But there was another voice she hadn't heard in a long time. "Why not? Just one time. Just once." "Okay," she said at last. "Just for a little while." "Now that sounds like an adventure," he replied, standing up. They reached the shore, and the dark water, lightly illuminated by the moonlight, stretched out in front of them. Jason quickly threw off his shirt, tossed it on the sand, and stepped into the water. Emma froze for a moment, still hesitant to follow him. "Come on," he called out, standing knee-deep in the ocean. "The water is warm. You won't regret it." She stepped gingerly into the water, feeling the sand beneath her feet fade away, giving way to soft waves. The breeze touched her skin, and the sound of the surf seemed to drown out her thoughts. Jason stepped closer, his face expressing pure joy. He looked like a man who was completely absorbed in the moment. "How was it?" he asked. "Unusual," Emma admitted. "You know, that's life. Doing things you've never done before. That's what life is all about." She nodded, not knowing what to say. Everything inside of her was jumbled. This feeling of freedom she was experiencing now was unfamiliar. Her heart was beating faster than usual. Suddenly, she felt Jason touch her arm. It wasn't harsh, not insistent. His hand, slightly damp from the water, just covered her fingers, and Emma didn't pull her hand away. It was like something clicked in her head. The world froze for a second, leaving only the sound of the ocean and their quiet breathing. Tension hung in the air, and she knew she'd gone too far, but she couldn't stop. And frankly, she didn't want to. Night fell over Miami in a soft, almost intimate blanket as the last glimmers of sunset light gave way to the shimmering moon. On the deserted beach, where only the rustle of the surf and the gentle hiss of the waves broke the silence, Emma and Jason stood side by side. Jason's gaze was calm, confident, a silent assurance that this was no time for doubt or hesitation. His eyes, deep and a little wild, spoke more than any words. They promised freedom, risk, and the chance to let go of the familiar. Emma, feeling an unknown energy awakening in her, could no longer think about home and her husband. Everything that had been dear to her before seemed ghostly now, lost in the face of this moment. Her mind was full of conflicting thoughts, but with every breath she felt herself coming alive, becoming herself again, free, passionate, thirsty for life. On the beach, beneath the gentle rustle of the surf, Jason slowly approached her. He reached out his hand, and his touch was soft, almost reverent, yet sure. "Listen, Emma," he said softly, leaning closer. "Miami is meant to be lived, not just existed. Why don't you let yourself have this moment? Let the waves wash away the remnants of yesterday's fears." She nodded silently, making her heart beat faster. The first moments on the beach had been tender, almost imperceptible. Light kisses, the faint scent of the sea air, and the whisper of the wind, as if pushing her toward a decision she could no longer control. She let herself surrender to the wave of passion, even as the echoes of reason flickered inside her, telling her that this was madness. But Jason didn't rush her, his gaze promising that every moment would be her choice, her small step into the unknown. They walked on the wet sand, their bare feet leaving footprints that were quickly washed away by the sea. Jason stopped at the water's edge. He turned to Emma, and there was a spark in his eyes that masked determination and desire. "Look," he said, pointing to the infinity of the ocean. "That's how far you can go if you're not afraid of getting lost." Emma looked at his finger, then back into his eyes. She felt the desire come in waves. For the first time on this secluded beach, she let herself forget everything, surrendering to Jason, his gentle kisses and caresses growing more insistent each time. Their kisses were long and greedy, as if they were trying to absorb the essence of the night, dissolving her fears and inhibitions into the sea. Each time her resistance weakened, Jason only touched her face gently, his gaze saying, "You're safe, you're with me." And Emma responded in kind, letting her hands find new ways, new feelings that had been out of her reach before. Back at the hotel, they found themselves in a room where the subdued light of the lamps created an atmosphere of mystery and coziness. The air was lightly scented with night and sea breeze, and the sounds of the city, distant and silent, seemed distant, almost mythical. Jason closed the door carefully, and now it was only here with him. His gaze told her again that words were unnecessary. All that mattered was conveyed through touch, whispers, and the warmth of their bodies. That night, they melded together, repeating to each other the moments of passion that were just beginning to awaken in Emma the sensations she'd never known before. She'd cringed a few times, first when the waves of her senses hit on the beach, and then in the warm space of the room, where each kiss had been a revelation. Jason was attentive. He never rushed her, but his presence made her realize that this night was the point of no return. And the more she surrendered to that feeling, the more she realized that there was no past to interfere with the present. As the morning sky began to shimmer outside the window, and the first rays of light cautiously crept into the room, Emma lay in silence, feeling everything inside her change. Jason, beside her, seemed so calm, as if he knew that this night had been a turning point in her new life. But along with the slight sense of release, a vague, uneasy foreboding grew in her soul. The last moments of the night, filled with the whispering of the waves and quiet breathing, left Emma with the feeling that now her life had split into two parts, one in which she was the same, and another where every moment was imbued with a new meaning, a new choice. Morning entered softly, weaving golden light into the room through the thin curtains. Emma slowly opened her eyes, feeling a pleasant tiredness throughout her body. For a second, she thought she was still dreaming, but it was enough to turn her head and see Jason for reality to finally wake up with her. He was standing at the minibar, already dressed, absently twirling a lemon slice in his fingers. Calm, confident, as if the night before had been a matter of course, of no consequence. Emma looked at him, trying to figure out how she felt. There was no loud emotion, no fear, no regret, no euphoria. Just a slight desolation and a strange realization that everything had already happened. She reached up, covering herself with the sheet, and before she could change her mind, she asked the question that had been swirling on her tongue. What are we going to do next? Jason grinned without turning around. He dropped the lemon into the glass, poured himself some water, and finally looked at her, raising an eyebrow. There was no we, Emma. It was just a moment. I gave it to you. Don't thank me. He took a sip, continuing to look at her with the same slight smirk that didn't have an ounce of seriousness in it. Like he hadn't said all those things to her last night, hadn't looked at her in a way that made her knees tingle, hadn't run his fingers over her skin, giving her goosebumps. Emma frowned. Just a moment? What did you expect? Jason sat down on the edge of the bed, sliding his hand casually down her leg. That I'd say, Emma, you're the love of my life. Let's run away together, he said. He laughed, and that laugh confused her completely. Honestly, I thought, she trailed off, realizing she didn't know what she was expecting. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to an almost conspiratorial whisper. If it's easier for you, you can assume I seduced you with cunning and guile. He winked, and Emma rolled her eyes, but she felt strangely light at heart, like it really was just a moment. So, no morning kisses, no confessions, no dramatic scenes? She asked, pulling the sheet higher. Jason stood up and stretched, gathering his things. I'm sorry, gorgeous, but I'm not the kind of guy who likes to complicate things. Emma couldn't help but smile. It was all so simple, and that was probably the main danger in it, because if it really was that easy, she might want to do it again. When Emma got home, everything looked the same as it had before. The same walls, the same cozy mess in the bedroom, the same husband who greeted her with a warm smile and a cup of freshly brewed coffee. How was the trip? He asked, kissing her lightly on the cheek. Good, she answered, almost without thinking. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. Why should he have noticed? She was back on time. No strange calls or changes in behavior. Everything was perfect on the outside, but something had changed on the inside. Emma hadn't thought so deeply about her life before. She lived according to the usual scenario: work, home, weekends with friends, occasional trips. Now, thinking back to Miami, she realized how monotonous her life had been before. Not in the sense of bad, just too, right? Jason had left nothing but a faint memory in her life. He hadn't written, he hadn't called, he hadn't taken any interest in her future. For him, it really was just a moment. But for her, Sometimes she caught herself thinking that she wanted that feeling again, the freedom, the excitement, the newness. Not specifically with Jason, but just with someone. Somewhere. Once, sitting in a restaurant with her husband, she'd noticed the man at the next table cast a quick, appraising glance at her. And instead of her usual neutral response, avert her eyes, smile politely, forget, she allowed herself a second to dwell on that moment. Just a second. But now she knew where such seconds could lead. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.